Hello, I'm Dave March, and welcome to the latest episode of Land of Confusion, the show where we talk to interesting people. And this is my co-host, Paul.
Hello, everyone. I'm Paul O'Brien, Houston native appraiser and curious individual.
Yeah. And Mark, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, I'm not sure I fall under the category of interesting person, but you're stuck with me anyway for today. I am I guess you could say I'm a rocket scientist because I've been an engineer off and on at Johnson Space Center since 1979. I'm back on my third trip there, and I'm doing analysis on the Lunar Gateway station that they're going to be putting in lunar orbit. I also am a author. I've written about 50 history books, mostly focused on either military history or maritime history. And I'm on Ricochet as sea writer, basically because my late wife did not want me using my real name on Ricochet, and I've kept the handle since then. So
Cool. So, what initially drew you? If we could get started, I always like to get to know you guys a little bit and sort of the path in. What initially got into you into rock? Were you more of an engineer or a scientist?
Oh, I'm an engineer. My degree is in naval architecture and marine engineering.
Okay.
And I ended up interviewing for a job with Lockheed Electronics, what was then Lockheed Electronics Company, operating out of Johnson Space Center when I was graduating. And the main reason that I did that was I couldn't understand why they would want a naval architect. And basically, it turned out that someone in the placement office had highlighted the wrong major on the interview form. This was back in the day when everything was done on paper. So, any rate,
what was the
I
intended?
looked at the interviewer.
What was the intended?
I looked at the interviewer. He looked at me. I said, "We're both here. Let's find out what we have to offer." And he's telling me about the position. And they did dynamic analysis, and he did part of a vibration matrix that they use to analyze shuttle vibration, and left some slots blank, but I could sort of fill them out. And I guess I'm an inveterate crossword puzzle solver. So while he's talking, I fill the thing out, and he looks at it and he says, "This is right. You can do this?" And I said, "Well, we covered this in my ship dynamics class yesterday. It was just coincidence." Any rate, they made me an offer, and I thought, "Oh, cool." And this was in '79, before the shuttle first flew. And I thought, "Oh, cool. I can come down to Houston, which also had a big offshore industry, and I can work in the shuttle program for a year, and then or for a few years, and then after that I can switch back to offshore platforms, building offshore platforms, dine out in the fact that I've been a rocket scientist for a while." And ended up that about the time I'm thinking about switching was when they had the big oil bust back in the 1980s. So I stayed with the shuttle program, and part of the thought was that aerospace and oil are contracyclical, so I'd always have a job. And then, of course, in '86 they blew up the shuttle, and things got real tight. But I ended up staying there. I did real-time navigation of the shuttle for several years, and then I switched to navigation analysis, and then I switched to space station, and then I decided this was back when Space Station Freedom was going to be the space station, and they canceled that, and I decided that aerospace was too cyclical, so I was going to move into something else. And for 8 years, I did e-commerce, which is even more cyclical than aerospace. Ended up coming back to Houston in 2002 to work on the shuttle program again, because they had moved the program office from California to Houston, and none of the Californians at the time wanted to relocate to a barbaric place like Texas. Their prejudice was my opportunity. Stayed there until the shuttle program ended, and decided that I didn't want to wait until things picked back up again. Recast myself as a tech writer, worked in a whole bunch of different industries over the next dozen years, including oil industry, airline, aircraft manufacturing, and of all things, writing documentation for call centers. Then in 2021, I got a call from the company I'm currently working for, and they said, would you be interested in working on the Lunar Gateway program? Now, mind you, at that point, I'd been gone from aerospace, from space and JSC for nearly a dozen years. And I had had trouble coming back the last time when I was gone only 8 years. And my immediate reaction was, this is a prank phone call, isn't it? And it turned out, no, they were serious. The Gateway program was rapidly expanding, and they'd run out of people. And I had a lot of the relevant experience, so I've been there ever since, and I'll probably stay there until that contract shuts down, which may be 4 or 5 years from now. Then I'll write full-time. My original plan was to start writing full-time in January 2022. So I've ended up cutting back on the writing that I do, because this job with Gateway is just so much fun that I don't want to give it up. It also pays real well. All of a sudden, when I don't need the money, I'm getting more money than I've ever earned in my life. So
that's how it works normally.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's a real cool story up to just to give us an idea of kind of where you're going. It's interesting hearing your pathway in. One of my buddies who I went to college with, he was aerospace engineer for Boeing for a little bit, and then he got taken by Bezos's company, and they're working on their lunar program. But when he was at NASA, he was working on the space station and their projects at the time. So It was always really interesting to hear the interactions he would have. But one thing he always talked about, and I'm not sure who leads the project for Lunar Gateway again.
I'm sorry.
Who leads the project for Gateway, for the Lunar Gateway?
I honestly don't know if you can say anyone leads it.
It's just collaborative.
Because it's made up of a number of different modules that are built by different companies. Northrop Grumman, I think, builds the Halo. I can't remember the names of all of the companies that are building the various modules. But the NASA project office is kind of leading the whole thing. And I work in level 2 flight software area. Level 2 being, the whole space station. Level 3 is either a module or a system. For example, the power and propulsion element would be a module, and that's got the engines for the whole thing and most of the solar panels. And it's kind of like a set of Tinker Toys. In that you just sort of plug it together. It's like I said, it's pretty cool. About a year ago, one of the things I do is review new documents for technical content, And a year ago, I ended up reviewing the requirements for the lunar surface transportation systems, things like the bus or the
Rover.
buggy, the rovers, and things
Yeah.
like that.
My buddy was
And
on
I'm
that.
looking at this and I'm reading it and I'm thinking, damn, when I was a kid, this was science fiction.
Yep.
This is going to be real.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so it's
Do we
like
want
you
to
said,
talk a
it's
little
cool.
bit about what the Lunar Gateway is for the people at home who haven't gone and Googled it immediately like I did?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. What it is it is it's literally a space station. It will be at lunar orbit and it will be trailing behind the moon as the moon goes around the Earth, and it will be trailing behind the moon, circling a spot in space. It's called a halo orbit. So it literally goes around and around the spot behind the moon. From there, you can use that as a staging platform for missions to the moon, particularly to the lunar poles. That's one reason they don't have a space station orbiting the moon itself, is because then all of a sudden you've got a lot of difficulty getting to different spots on the moon. But it's like I said, this halo orbit provides pretty good access to the moon.
Mhm.
The gateway is made up of about 7 modules: power and propulsion, the habitat. I don't remember what HALO stands for. It's the habitat module.
Mhm.
The International Habitat Module, or the IHAB, which is an expansion of the HALO can handle 4 people uncomfortably. IHAB allows you to handle, I believe, up to 8 people, but don't hold me to that.
Mhm.
And it actually has a toilet,
That's always a
which the
plus.
HALO does not.
One thing,
Amused me.
one thing my
There's
buddy
an airlock.
one thing my buddy always said about the modules going into it, he said the most frustrating part when working on that project was the bidding process for all and the supply chain for all the components to go in to the final inputs
Yeah.
of the Lunar Gateway. And he would tell me how it was so annoying how they would work for months and months in Boeing for this input for the project, and then they would get outbid by a competitor who doesn't even have infrastructure, but just throws this really crazy idea out there at a price that's totally unreasonable. And because they lobby well, Congress buys into it. They end up going with it, and then they use other companies' infrastructure to build their idea. Is that something you've kind of seen, like that sort of?
No, from what I've seen, the various HALO modules are coming together fairly well.
Oh, really? That's
Yeah, the long pole seems to be, I hate to say, the Boeing ride to the moon. So they still haven't. The NASA still has not had a manned orbital mission to the moon. When they started Gateway, it was supposed to have been done this year. Now that was several years back. It slipped to next year, and we'll see if that happens.
right.
And that's essentially going to be a repetition of the old Apollo 8 mission, where you go out to the moon, orbit it, and then come back. And it's like I said, I'm not sure exactly where Gateway is. I do know they're finishing up the flight software part of it early next year, and are going to start doing the integrated testing on it by summer. So That seems to be coming along at any rate. But besides the Halo and the power and propulsion module, there's the International Habitat. That's being headed up by ESA, the European Space Agency, and Japanese are also contributing to that. There's also supposed to be an airlock module, and what's called the external vehicular robotics, which is a robot arm that Canada is building that actually can move from one module to another, rather like a crab moving from one set of anchor points to another. And in fact, when it's supposed to come up in one of the logistics modules, mounted in the exterior of it, and then from there it's going to walk over to the main part of Gateway and be available for that from then on. They've also got a number of manned systems that they're going to be using to go from the Gateway to the moon. And I don't really know the details of those at this point.
Okay. Well, it sounds like you are, involved with quite a bit and have an idea of the big picture. I deal with a decent. It sounds like a lot of stuff that you have to go very deep into, and as a person who's also in a very data heavy field where you got to be zoned in on certain things or large systems, trying to make them simple. I have to have a relationship with something that has absolutely nothing to do with work. So how do you counterbalance the focus of your job, because you can't miss a beat? But what's sort of the decompressor for you that balances it all out?
Oh man, you're going to laugh at this. Part of it is making models.
Really? I believe it.
I do a lot of I do a lot of model making. Another part of it is the writing that I do. I come home and I write a book, and it's about something completely unrelated to space.
Right.
Right now, I'm writing a book about U.S. submarine interactions with Japanese aircraft carriers in World War II. And it's you end up discovering some things that seem obvious after you think about it, but end up being surprising when you first realize it. For example, there was no U.S. submarine sunk as a result of an encounter with a Japanese aircraft carrier. And that sounds kind of strange at first, until you realize that the blasted carriers were so valuable and the Japanese had so few anti-submarine warfare ships that if the submarine actually hit a carrier, the rest of the carrier group would end up scurrying off, taking most of the destroyers with it. And the destroyer that was left behind couldn't stay very long, because that carrier group would typically be moving at 18 to 20 knots, and that destroyer could move maybe 30 knots. And if it stayed with that U.S. submarine longer than 3 or 4 hours, it would have a day or two trying to catch up with its task force. So it was just one of those weird things that you notice. Basically, the way the Japanese sank a U.S. submarine was to keep it down long enough that it ran out of air and they had to surface. But they couldn't do that with a carrier group. They could do that with a freight convoy, because those ships moved so slowly.
So with your writing, do you prefer to do historical nonfiction, or is this like historical fiction, like sort of based on a true story?
This is all nonfiction. There's a very simple reason for that, and that is that it's easier for me to sell nonfiction than it is to sell fiction. the thing about writing a nonfiction book, you can put together what's called a book proposal, send that off, and have that accepted and get a contract in hand. So, you don't really have to write very much of it before you know that, by golly, you'll get paid for it. Well, if you write a novel, everyone and their kid sister is writing novels.
Right.
So you've got a lot of competition. And B, if you expect to get it published, you have to write the blasted thing, finish it up, then send that to the publisher. So there's absolutely no guarantee after you've written 80,000 words that anyone's going to be interested in it. And, from my standpoint, life's too short.
Right.
I can get a contract to write a book about, like the U.S. submarines against Japanese carriers. I finished one up earlier this year, U.S. Pacific Fleet in 1941. I'd rather write something I know is going to get published. If I did not have a day job, then I'd probably start writing some of the novel series that I've got outlined on my computer. I've got one maritime adventure series set in the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic era. I've got another set of mystery novels set in a town in East Texas that is very similar to one that I lived in for 8 years. But I've just got outlines of those, and those are things I plan to get around to sometime.
Here's
the problem is...
I'm just going to interject. Another problem with publishing, you have to make sure you keep the rights to your work. If you fail, if your first book out of the gate doesn't succeed, often the publisher will have rights for it that will last for 20 years. And then, and if you're writing a series, you often want to write. What is common happens if you write 2 books, people will go buy back the first book, and you'll actually build an audience over time. But unless you self-publish, you won't get that kind of thing. That's one of the reasons why I went to self-publish.
So I'm curious, Mark, with the ability, I mean, obviously, what can sell, or at least what's attracted to publisher in the nonfiction category. Do you know who your target audience is, or when you write your books, who do you have in mind is reading these works that you're writing? Well,
for the stuff that I'm currently writing, I've got a pretty good picture of the audience. They're people like me that get really interested in odd corners of maritime or military history. And the thing is, most of the books I write are for Osprey, and I sometimes joke that it's paint by numbers because they give you the outline that they want for the book. And you can change that somewhat, but they ask for, say, 15,000 words and 8 plates, new artwork. I don't do the artwork. What I do is send I send what's called an artist's brief that describes what should be on the plate, often in very great detail. And with Osprey, they'll either have what they call plates, bird's eye views, which are sort of a 3D map or maps that you have to put together. The other company I tend to write for is History Press, and I've done, I believe, 8 for them, and that's typically local history. One of the books that I wrote was a history of the battleship Texas, which has been preserved as a war memorial and another one was about the cruiser Houston, which was sunk during the Java Sea campaign in 1942, and which the town of Houston still has fairly close relations with. I've got one that I'm supposed to put together for them when I get the time, called Forgotten Houston Aviation, which is 15 stories dealing with aviation in Houston. It would include things like a chapter on Continental Airlines, the first military airfield in Houston or in Texas, was in Lamarck, which is just south of Houston. Things like that. I did one called Forgotten Houston Landmarks, which was about 15 things in Houston that were important to the city and sometimes critically important to the city at one time, and that have been forgotten since then. Things like the Houston Cotton Exchange. That was one of the main reasons why Houston grew to the size it was, but by the 60s, nobody cared about it anymore, and it died.
That's the title.
15 in fact, nobody really knows where.
Real
I'm sorry?
The title of that was 15 Important Forgotten Things of Houston. What was the title of that you were describing?
Oh, that is Vanished Houston Landmarks.
Okay. I might be interested to read. So
I also did one called.
Oh, no, I was going to say I'm an appraiser out of Houston.
I also did one called Vanished. I'm sorry?
I'm an appraiser out of Houston, so I like to read up on these important markers and these drivers in Houston. So this is really fascinating. I'm probably actually going to read this later, so I wanted to take a note of that.
Okay. The other one that I wrote is The Vanished Texas Coast, and that's 15 stories about Texas maritime history that's been pretty much forgotten. Things like the town of Indianola, which was destroyed by 2 hurricanes. It was the second largest port in Texas until it got hit by 2 hurricanes and disappeared. Also wrote one about history of Ellington Field, which is another interesting thing because it was the high-tech airfield for the Army Air Corps in World War I. It ended up being a major training base in World War II, and was important to NASA when they moved down here in the 1960s, and is now a spaceport. They're going to be having orbital rockets launching from Ellington. These are the ones that are launching horizontally off of, I'll call them aircraft, and then use an upper stage to get into space. So,
Let's see.
So here's interesting.
Kind of like UFO.
Yeah. So here's a question I have for you as far as nonfiction writing goes. There is a lot of people, and I include myself in this group, that are big, nerds about history, can go into the rabbit hole about stuff. And I'm sure more than one time have thought to myself, man, I'd love to write about this at some point in time. But obviously there's not that defined of a path to doing that. How did you develop your nonfiction writing style? Where did you start, and how do you feel it's developed over the course of 20 books?
The best way to put it is I fell into it as accidentally as I fell into my NASA career.
Really?
I had started writing magazine articles in the 1990s, and I'd written a series of them for Osprey Military Quarterly, which ceased publication after I'd written about 4 articles. And the editor and I were communicating via email, and I said, "So what do I do now?" And he said, "Why don't you write a book for us?" And I said, "I've never written a book before." And he said, "Well, here's your chance to start." And through a series of conversations, we came up with the idea of doing a new vanguard on the U.S. frigates, like the Constitution, the ones that had 24-pound gun main battery. And he walked me through that. And it's like I said, they have an outline for the thing. And when I got done with that one, it was fairly well received. And he talked me into doing another one. And actually, I did one about the space shuttle because at that time I was not working on the space program, but I had access to something that's called the Space Shuttle Data Book, which had all the diagrams I needed for the cutaways and stuff like that. And because they were a military printing house, I did that one focusing on the military use of the shuttle, which no one had done before. And it included things like the whole fact they were going to use Vandenberg for polar launches, and the fact that the original shuttle design had straight wings, stubby wings, but they went to the double delta design for the shuttle so that they would get enough what's called cross track, so that they could still land in the continental United States if they launched from Vandenberg. Basically, the Earth turns at about, I think it's 1,200 miles an hour, 1,000 miles an hour.
Yeah.
Okay, 1,000 miles an hour. And with a straight wing, they could change the trajectory by 300 miles left or right of the path. With the double delta design, they could switch at 1,500 miles, which meant you could launch from Vandenberg, go up, find something, rendezvous with it, deorbit, and land in Vandenberg at the end of one rev, and show this brand new Russian satellite that you'd found, say, "It followed me home. Can I keep it?" That was literally one of the design reference missions for the shuttle.
Interesting.
When it was first put together back in the 60s. And then, of course, what happened was the dealing with that as the Russians is real simple. You put some type of bomb on your satellite that's triggered by an accelerometer. So if somebody picks it up and carries it off, it goes boom, and it will go boom when it's in the shuttle payload bay as it's returning to orbit, returning to Earth. So basically, the Air Force decided that maybe we wouldn't do that. But they kept the double delta wings because the design had gone that far down the path. And of course, that double delta wing is one of the things that caused the loss of Columbia. And, because basically the shuttle came in a lot hotter due to that double delta wing design. With the original straight wing design, it was going to do a lot of the slowing down in the very upper atmosphere, and therefore it would have been a lot cooler re-entry. Any rate, the other interesting thing is the segmented SR solid rocket boosters were segmented because that was the only way you could get them through a tunnel that led to Vandenberg. They were thinking of making one-piece solid rocket boosters, and they could barge those to Kennedy Space Center. But the only way you could get it to Vandenberg was via a railroad tunnel with a very tight curvature.
Huh.
So that's the reason that you had segmented SRBs. And of course, that's what caused the the Challenger accident, was a leak through the joint in the SRB. So basically, we lost 2 shuttles because of the military requirements that were put in when it was designed, that were never used and never needed.
So I have a question for you. When it comes to writing about these nonfiction topics, I've read. I had a little bit of time in software engineering. Reading engineering manuals can be the driest thing ever. How do you go into more specialized esoteric topics that can be very dry? How do you keep it interesting for readers who might just be picking it up just to see what's inside?
Well,
what has developed over your writing that has helped you, or maybe critique that has helped you to make a better, more captivating book for very low level information?
Well, basically, you tell a story. You don't just present the facts. You put the facts together as a story. And for example, when I wrote a book about Grierson's raid, which was a cavalry raid that went from Tennessee to Louisiana, I opened the book by describing a sleeping Union officer on horseback coming into the Union lines in Louisiana and sound asleep. And he was captured by 2 of the Union pickets, woken up, and insisted that he'd come from Tennessee with a unit that did not belong to the Union Army in Louisiana. The thing is that really happened. Grierson's force had ended up stopping at a abandoned plantation north of the Union lines, and he sent in 1 rider to make contact with them, and the guy was exhausted because he'd been awake 36 hours and fell asleep. But the horse smelled the stables and was heading for the stables, which were, of course, in Union lines. Guy told the story. The Union sent out their own cavalry patrol to discover whether or not this guy was telling the truth, and of course it turned out he was. And they led the Grierson's brigade, 3 regiments, back into the Union lines, along with something like, I believe it was close to 1,000 slaves that had taken the opportunity to seek their own freedom. But the point is, that's how I opened the book, with the arrival of Grierson via a sleeping emissary. And, it made you want to read the rest of the book.
Right.
So and then you work it out from there. The other thing is, you don't just present the dry statistics, you explain why they are important. An example of that is, the U.S. submarine sank 6 Japanese carriers and severely damaged another 10, but the Japanese never got a piece of a U.S. submarine that was attacking the carriers. Why is that? And again, the explanation ends up being, it's like I said, pretty obvious once you sort it out, but it's still surprising and interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of it. But the basic thing is, you want to tell a story. You don't fudge the facts, but you do put them in a way that is entertaining and interesting.
Yeah.
So on that term, entertaining and interesting, who do you personally, is there anyone you model your own style after, or maybe someone you could comment
Not
to?
really.
You've come across it as you've
Yeah, same here.
I just developed it as I was going along.
Who would you
and
say? Oh, sorry. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead and
Well,
ask.
who would you say is one of the better storytellers in the world of like nonfiction?
Eric Larson.
Eric Larson.
Yeah, he wrote. He's got one out right now about Fort Sumter. I haven't read it yet, but he's written I think the first one he wrote was about the Chicago Fair and a serial killer that was associated.
Oh yeah, the one about H.H. Holmes. Yeah.
Right. He's one. Oh God, I can't remember his name.
H.H. is still pretty good.
What is it about his style that you find remarkable?
The fact that they are not just presenting facts, but that they are putting it into a larger context and into an interesting context. The recent book out about Diesel would be an example of that. I'm trying to drag some of these things out of my memory because, I know. The Last Outlaws is a book that I recently reviewed for Epic Times, and that was another example of where the guy told laid out a historical story in what I thought was an extremely absorbing manner. He drew parallels between the James Younger gang and the Dalton gang, which appeared like 20, 30 years later. Jesse James and Cole Younger ended up getting shot to pieces trying to rob a bank in Northfield, Minnesota. And then about in the 1880s, the Daltons tried to rob a bank in Missouri, 2 banks in Missouri, Coffeyville, and again, ended up getting shot to pieces. The thing that fascinated me about the book wasn't that the Daltons were these master criminals, but they were pretty much the gang that couldn't shoot straight. They managed to capture a train, and then couldn't get into the safe in the mail car because they hadn't brought anything to do that with. I guess it kind of dumbfounded me how dumb criminals can be.
Right. Yeah. It doesn't surprise me, but I have a redneck side of my family that doesn't come out that much. But I have never relatives or friends or relatives who've ended up in like county equivalents, and their descriptions of most of the people in there are really dumb. The guys are dumb enough to get caught.
Yeah.
One question I have for you, and this is something I'm growing more interested in the more I hear you talk, is you've said you've had your works well received. You've had like solid critique. I'm curious, as an author, have you ever received a piece of feedback or critique that redefined your method of writing? Or
no.
that was exceptionally valuable? No?
Not really. The editors give me guidance, and I don't know whether I have I suspect that I had a propensity to write what they are looking for rather than developing that. And I don't know how to describe it. It's like I said, a lot of it was accidental.
Well, something I'm curious about, because this is something I've struggled with personally with my own report writing, because a lot of what I do is from the perspective of an expert. And what's scary about my kind of work is people will listen to it uncritically. And it keeps me up sometimes wondering, is this good enough? And I imagine every author runs into this problem of, is this enough? Did I go far enough? How do you go? How do you go with what is your process for saying, all right, clean, we're done, send it? Because with history, I feel you can always go a little deeper.
The thing is that I think what you're describing is technical writing. And I did that for 12 years. Mm-hmm. And basically, a lot of what I did were user's manuals. Mm-hmm. And that's the type of thing you're worried about, I would imagine, because if they screw up, and we're not necessarily talking software, we're talking, in one case, oil drilling systems. So if you screw things up, you end up getting kicked when you're drilling the well, and all of a sudden, the whole platform gets tipped over by what comes up.
Right.
So the thing is that what we did, it's going to sound strange, we'd give it to the stupidest person in the group and have him go through it. And if he understood it, we'd done it right.
That is not stupid. That's actually genius.
We never told them why we were giving that.
He's sitting there thinking his opinion value is the most valued. It's just like,
well, it sounded like it was, but not for the reason he thought.
So, but the thing is, as far as the history stuff that I write for popular audiences, one, I try very desperately not to use formulas.
Okay.
Two, I try and put in a lot of analogies, because people can understand the analogy. For example, with some of the books that I was writing about U.S. frigates, the Federal Navy tended to overgun their ships. They put a whole bunch of cannons in a very small area.
Yeah. And
basically, that meant that they had too much weight in the bow and sterns, and the ships would hog, which means the bow and stern would sink and the center would rise. And as I recall in the book, I said, it's as if you took a pencil and you push down on both ends while pushing up in the middle with your other hand, so that people could imagine what hogging was. Mm-hmm. And again, you have to figure out ways to make things clear. And I try and write on a 6th grade level. That is, that the book should be understandable to someone that's been through 6th grade.
As opposed to not like glance.
The thing is that there are a bunch of people that think you're a good writer if you write something that's so complicated only grad students can understand it.
Right.
But what that means, what that says to me, is you're too lazy to make it understandable.
Correct.
Mm-hmm. So,
no, that's something my mentor told me when I was first, and because I was the guy who loved to write up all the geeky stuff, and my mentor said, Paul, no one's going to understand a word of this geeky crap you put here, and even if they did, they wouldn't care.
Mm-hmm. And they'll be annoyed at you. That's something I've sometimes experienced reading.
Right. Well, it is a problem in the professional corporate style, because people write in that sort of format to scare people away from reading any farther. And it's a bad habit,
Right.
I find, in the professional sphere, that they put these $5, they just fill these paragraphs with these $5 words,
Right.
and they use statistics to scare people away, and like, oh no, he knows what he's doing. Like it seems, and it's terrible, because it's like, no, if you can't read this stuff, you haven't read it. And it's annoying to hear politicians read off this stuff when you can just observe that they probably don't know what they might be able to read off the page, but they don't understand what they're reading.
Right. The thing is that I made my living for about a dozen years dealing with those types of documents and turning them into something readable, and made a very good. You can, if you can write clearly, and you can take an incomprehensible technical manual and turn it into something readable, you can make a lot of money that way.
Right.
So, like one of the last tech writing jobs I had was writing operating manuals for super tankers.
Mm-hmm.
And that was cool. I mean, I talk about letting loose your inner Walter Mitty.
Right.
I had to put myself in the position of a tanker officer,
Mm-hmm.
and write something they could read and understand. So
that's really cool.
Yeah.
So
it was.
You should send a copy of that book off to Rob Long there, Mark. Apparently he loves super tankers and cargo ships, cargo barges.
Except for the fact that the work that I did for them is under NDA. I can tell you I've done it, but I can't release it.
Mm-hmm.
So
makes sense.
That's the frustrating part about being a tech writer. People never see your best work.
In the world of between tech and history, you have some folks that in certain gray areas stand on certain subjects. Have you ever written a book or a piece that was met with strong criticism or just controversy?
Oh, absolutely.
Really?
Absolutely.
Tell us, please.
Some of it,
your experience with that.
Well, some of it's trivial. One guy ripped apart my book about the siege of Rabaul because I didn't mention his father's unit in it. Well, his father's unit was attacking New Guinea, and it wasn't even part of the attack on Rabaul. So it's like, how do you deal with something like that? But there are times when I find something that goes against the conventional wisdom, and I'll end up getting criticism for it. And basically, I don't care.
Yeah.
Right.
I know that I've got the facts on my side. For example, one of the things that I discovered when I was writing the book about the U.S. Pacific Fleet in 1941 is that the U.S. Navy was all in on carriers, a lot more so than they're given credit for.
Right.
The problem is they didn't have enough aircraft carriers to go around, and they weren't going to get a whole bunch of them until 1943. And they were basically building their doctrine around what they had, which were battleships, because that's what they had to fight with. It was the old story of you fight the war with what you've got, not what you want.
You also fight in the last war you fought.
Well, except they really weren't. That's the thing that's the myth. But I discovered no. They were very focused on air. Part of it, one of the things that most people don't realize is that the Japanese Kaido Batu, the fast carrier fleet that they had, was the first time ever that more than two carriers were put together in a single task force. And it turns out that when you increase the number of carriers, the effectiveness doesn't increase linearly. It increases multiplicatively or possibly even exponentially.
Right.
Because you look at the difference between the two U.S. carriers that raided Rabaul and the 9 carriers that raided Truk a few months later, and the impact is just remarkable. So the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor with 6 carriers was something that had never been done before. It certainly hadn't been done with 370 odd aircraft, and it was just something that was beyond people's expectations.
Yeah. Was it Toronto was supposed to have a second carrier, but it was having mechanical issues, I believe.
Right. Well, more than that, the British never had more than about 20 aircraft on any of their aircraft carriers.
True.
They had, I swear they had more aircraft carriers than they had carrier aircraft.
Yeah.
I
think it's until the Ark Royale shows up in 43, they get a proper carrier.
So,
the Ark Royal was sunk, I think, in 1941.
No,
but the thing is, even there, even there, you're only talking about a handful of aircraft. It was sad.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yes and no. They did other things, like the fact they had an armored flight deck, and as they said, in what was in 44, the American Observer notices it's during the kamikaze, and they hit the British carrier, and they just bulldoze the thing off, and the guy said that would be 6 months in port for any one of ours. So.
Right, but the problem was the British never had enough aircraft until 43 or so, and they were mostly getting their carrier aircraft from the United States.
Right.
And a lot of that was due to the fact the RAF was controlling carrier aircraft production, and they were completely uninterested in carrier aircraft.
So I had been talking a lot about the writing styles, the process, and all coming together. And I wanted to turn the conversation towards more modern issues that maybe you see with publishing and writing, specifically history, because that's one thing going through your profile I really admire about you is your commitment to touching those areas that really aren't broad. You go deep, and people love that, and really it helps bring a lot of things together when you start bringing all these books and connecting a lot of dots. My question to you is, with the current atmosphere of publishing and its as an institution, do you think there is a greater threat to history for censorship or revisionism? Because I feel like there's both going on this day. What do you think is a bigger threat to the current writing of history at the moment, censorship or revisionism?
I think that's one where you embrace the power of and. It's hard to say. I also review books, and in the last 3 years, last year in particular, it's amazing how difficult it is to find good history books that aren't tainted by good books, period, that aren't tainted by woke philosophies. And the thing is, sometimes they'll contradict what they've been saying the whole book in order to pay homage to, climate change or something like that. There are a lot of books that I've not reviewed because they went all in on woke in something that was completely inappropriate. There was, a book about the Tunguska explosion that was fairly good, but at the end he concluded that this proved that we needed to worry about climate change. It's like, what? There was another history of barbed wire where the author went off about how how Environmental Liberation Front was using barbed wire to stop those horrible loggers, and that God, who was the gay man that ended up getting beaten to death and tied up with barbed wire? And she said that that was an example of homophobia in the plains. And by the time the book had been written, it was realized that this guy had been beaten to death by his homosexual lover,
Right.
over a drug deal. Had nothing to do with homophobia.
Right.
So that was another book I didn't review.
What do you think? I guess, do you think that's inspired, or do you think that's pushed? Like, do you think that, or I guess not pushed, encouraged? Do you think that's something that's inspired by the authors, or do you think it's something that's encouraged to the author, that sort of behavior in writing?
It's hard to say, because I'm sure that it's encouraged by the publisher, but you can find enough people that will that are willing to write that in the first place. And in fact, that's kind of the focus of the book I'm going to be reviewing this Sunday, which is Not Stolen, which is about the current woke view that everything that the Europeans did in settling North America was evil, and that the Indians were one with nature and lived in communist and communal societies, and it's all, I can't use the word on ricochet, but horse manure.
Yes.
No, I mean the Indians, the various native tribes killed more of each other in wars than the Europeans killed Indians in warfare. And the European and Indian wars were actually fairly small and very unusual.
Yeah.
Hollywood doesn't give you that impression, but at any rate, this was a good book debunking all of that.
Yeah, I've had that. You know how they now do this kind of traditional thing where you're at a public event and they start thanking all the native tribe or First Nations tribes, as we call him here, and they keep mentioning one called the Attawandaron that were brutally murdered by the other tribes they keep mentioning every time, and I'm just like sitting there going like, you have no idea of the history here. It's like it's like killed every man over the age of 12 and enslaved the women and children. It's like, what?
I hate to say it, but that's kind of universal.
That's true. I remember that's what happened.
It happens all over.
Or something.
One thing that kind of makes me curious, because you're a vanguard of, and I'm not to put you on a pedestal, but you're a vanguard of history at the moment. You're writing the books, reviewing them. You are a gatekeeper to what will be written. And what advice do you got for a youngster like myself? I'm 30 years old, hope to start a family within the next 10 years. What advice could you give me to carry skepticism going into the future? Because while you're doing your part, obviously misinformation, revisionism, and censorship will go on. How do I, and also kind of teach my kids as well to have that skepticism to what's obviously going to be false and get through in the future? How do you keep that level of skepticism, but also enjoy reading history books? And how should a young person go through the future with as much revisionism as is happening at the moment?
Well, part of it is that even the history books that were written in the past were flawed. You just have to read them with an eye towards whether or not stuff fits together. If something seems wrong, it probably is. You may have to dig down and do some checking. But just because something is in print, it doesn't mean that it's true. I mean, a good example of that there's a book called Queen of the Flat Tops, which was about the Lexington at the Battle of Coral Sea. And it was written during World War II, and it's an entertaining book to read, but there are a lot of historical errors in it. In that case, the author was trying to do the best job that he could. He just was working with incomplete information. And really, in many ways, most authors are working with incomplete information, and you just have to look to see what is shaky and filter it out and take what's valuable from something and skip what's not, or skip over what's not. And if it's sufficiently flawed, you just kind of discard it.
Mhm.
The thing is that there's an old saying that if you want a new idea, read an old book. And one nice thing about this century is you've got more access to books that were written in the early 20th century, 18th century, 19th century, and 18th century than you did back in the 1990s when I first started writing. You can get a whole host of older books that are good starting points. A lot of them, again, new information has superseded them. But for example, like Charles Oman, who wrote some excellent books on medieval and early modern warfare. For years, you couldn't find his books except at places like the University of Michigan Graduate Library. That's where I ended up reading them when I was in high school. Now they're online. You can go to Gutenberg.org or Faded Page or a bunch of places like that and get a hold of them. And that's true with a lot of stuff. And, for example, on this book that I'm writing at present, I found the reports of the U.S. naval mission to Japan in 1945-46 online. And that gave me a tremendous amount of technical information about the Japanese Navy, and several of the illustrations that I'm using in that book, including one showing the damage to the Tahoe, came from those reports. That's something I could not have gotten 20 years ago. I'd read about them in, Morrison's History of the Pacific War, but there was no way I could access them. Now you can.
I have a follow-up question on that. When you were talking about reading these books out of the University of Michigan Library, in your opinion, because every single university has its own historical groupings, which historical group or university or, I guess, company, in your opinion, does the best work keeping true to U.S. history and the U.S. lore?
I really don't know the answer to that one.
Oh, really?
Probably Hillsdale College, but the reason I mentioned the University of Michigan is I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And by the time I was in 7th or 8th grade, I realized that the public library and the school library didn't have the information I wanted about the stuff that I wanted to write, for research papers for our history classes. And I discovered that I could go to the graduate library. At the time, the University of Michigan library system was the 4th largest in the nation. And I'd go down there on my bicycle, and I discovered if I behaved myself, I could read the books there. And the thing is that we were doing things like Xeroxing drawings of World War I battleships from, the Blazes naval annuals of that period, and using them for our war games. I ended up doing a paper on the Battle of Valcour Island. I think it was in 8th grade, using some books that had been published originally in the 1850s.
Wow.
And, it was like, and they didn't mind my reading those books as long as I didn't abuse them, and it was cool. But the thing is that unless you lived in Ann Arbor, Michigan, you didn't have access to that. Now you do. Sure. My bet is you could find that same book on the Battle of Valcour Island online somewhere.
Right.
So,
well, I want to sort of wind down the conversation and focus on today's date. That's December 7th, a day that will live in infamy, and several decades later still does. I wanted specifically to talk about Pearl Harbor, but more specifically, my favorite admiral, Chester Nimitz, and his words that he spoke when he arrived at Pearl Harbor after the attack, about the 3 mistakes the Japanese made when they attacked Pearl Harbor. And to me, it was just his absolute moment of grace under pressure after getting beaten down after the bombing. Number one, the Japanese attacked on a Sunday morning. 9 out of every 10 crewmen of those ships were ashore on leave. If they had attacked any other day, it would have been 38,000 men dead instead of 3,800. Number two, he saw the battleships lined up in a row, carried away, sinking those battleships. They never once bombed our dry docks opposite to those ships. If they had destroyed our docks, we would have had to tow every one of those ships to America to be repaired. As of now, they're in shallow waters, so we can have them repaired and at sea in no time. And third, every drop of fuel in the Pacific War Theater was on top of the ground storage 5 miles over that hill. One attack plane could have strafed those tanks and destroyed our fuel supply.
But they're all in the third wave. They didn't all in.
And it's just incredible leadership. And I was curious if you shared that same love for Nimitz that I do, or if you have a deeper take.
I do, but I'm not sure he said those exact words.
I'm paraphrasing.
He arrived and took command on December 31st. He'd arrived, I think, a few days earlier than that. So he was in Washington when Pearl Harbor was attacked. Now, what's interesting is the Japanese were going to attack the dry docks. However, when the Nevada sortied, most of the aircraft that were assigned to hit the dry docks saw this battleship moving down the channel, and they switched to the battleship. Right. They did sink they sank the floating dry dock. They ended up destroying the caisson and downs in dry dock number 1. And of course, there's a very famous picture of the destroyer Shaw blowing up, and that was in that floating dry dock, which ended up on the bottom of the harbor. Again, it was shallow water, and they refloated it fairly quickly. But the main thing is, and Nimitz is right about that, had the Japanese attacked the tank farms and destroyed that, the entire fleet would have had to have withdrawn to the Pacific coast, because that was the only place with enough fuel stored to support the U.S. fleet. And that's part of what I meant earlier when I said the Japanese were great warriors, but they didn't understand logistics. And that was the biggest error they made. Now, the interesting thing is that the U.S., and I talk about this in my book, Pacific Fleet 1941, that Kimmel was planning on using the battleships to lure the Japanese aircraft carriers within range of where he could attack them, and pretty much planned to attack them with the aircraft with our aircraft carriers. but they were supposed to sortie to Wake. And of course, they couldn't do that because they're sitting on the bottom of Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
But had they not been attacked and were able to sortie, before they would have gotten halfway to Wake, the Japanese would have ended up sinking the Prince of Wales and the Repulse using twin-engine bombers. And at that point, you're Kimmel on your flagship, and you've heard reports that the 2 British battleships were sunk by land-based bombers, and you're still 3 or 4 days from Wake Island. Are you going to push on, knowing that the Japanese could just as easily shift those twin-engine bombers to the Marshalls and attack your aircraft or attack your battleships with their aircraft? And trading our battleships for the Japanese carriers, hey, that's worth it. Trading our battleships for a couple dozen twin-engine bombers,
especially when your anti-aircraft isn't up to spec yet.
And they probably would have turned around, gone back to Pearl Harbor. Mm-hmm. There certainly was a lot of hesitation in those first few weeks after Pearl Harbor, and a lot of mistakes made. And one of the biggest ones was that when they tried to relieve Wake Island, they only used 1 carrier, and they had 2 other carriers that they had guarding the flanks. Well, no. I mean, what we knew a year later was they should have put all 3 of those carriers together and sailed as one big task force.
Right.
But again, that's being wise after the fact. We didn't know that at the time, and it took us a year to fully absorb that. Even at Midway, we didn't have the 3 carriers operating together. We had 2 carriers in one group and 1 carrier in the other. There were no plans at that point to get massed carrier formations, which is what we ended up using again at Rabaul in February 1944. So
I have an interesting
that's really one of the biggest things is simply you have to put things in the context of their times, not be wise after the fact.
Right.
All right. Well, I have a wise after the fact question, I think. And it's an interesting retrospective question, I think. If between all the naval admiralty talent that we had, in your opinion, was Nimitz the best man for the job at the time? And if we couldn't have picked Nimitz, who would have been the second best option to have led the Pacific Fleet?
Well, the best man for the job already had a job, and that was Ernie King. Yeah. King had more experience in carrier aviation than anyone else in the U.S. Navy. And the only reason that they did not have him as the commander of the Pacific Fleet instead of putting Kimmel there was because the Atlantic was hotter at the time, and they put him in charge of the Atlantic Fleet. So,
even though that's for almost only 1 carrier, I think the Ranger is the only carrier on that side of the ocean.
By that time, they also had the Yorktown there, and the Hornet was there.
Yeah.
They
had put that.
Yeah, well, they had that was just coming online. They really put too many carriers in the Atlantic, especially since at that time we really didn't have aerial depth charges that you could carry on aircraft, or although we developed them very, very quickly. But prior, I think we had them online by the time the war started. But still, you're not going to use fleet carriers for anti-submarine purposes. Yeah. That defeats the purpose. And we did end up using a lot of cheap carriers in the Atlantic quite successfully.
Yeah.
But again, we thought we were going to be sailing against the German fleet and that the Japanese were going to be intimidated into standing aside. Again, we screwed that one up. Actually, I think the nightmare scenario for the U.S. would have been if Japan attacked the Dutch and British and left us alone.
Yeah.
Because then it would have been very hard for the U.S. to have intervened. If the Japanese
or intervened in a different type of way, it would not have been. You might have been able to intervene, but there would not have been the righteous anger that you got from Pearl.
Right.
It would have been much more of a World War I type situation where it's like,
well, it would have been worse than that. It would have been that, wait a second, we're going to send our boys overseas to protect European colonies.
Yeah.
So,
right.
As opposed, and remember, I'm saying they don't attack the Philippines. Had the Japanese attacked the Philippines without attacking Pearl Harbor, that's actually what we expected.
Right.
And that was why Kimmel had this plan to lure the Japanese carriers into the Central Pacific with his battleships. So,
okay.
Can't remember another follow up on that. I can't remember if it was you I was discussing, but do you blame Kimmel and Short for coming up short in the defense, as I do, or do you have more sympathy towards them?
I've got more sympathy towards them, primarily because it's like I said, nobody understood the power of a massed carrier group that, like the Japanese were sending against Pearl Harbor. So it was a failure of imagination, but there were very few people that would have had sufficient imagination, including most of the Japanese admirals. Yamamoto threatened to resign if they didn't go along with the Pearl Harbor attack. And as it was, Nagomo ended up pulling his punches because he'd won what he thought was a big enough victory. They could have lost all of the carrier aircraft they had and traded those for that tank farm that you were talking about. And then it would have been a true strategic victory because we would have been forced back to the Pacific coast.
Yeah, I guess so. It's interesting to think that, the Japanese army with all these guys who are constantly overexceeding their authority and going for broke and all sorts of crazy situations. And then you have this very the victory's big enough for me, so I can go home with the bit more conservative admiralty. Because I can tell you, the Japanese army guy types were there. They would not care.
Yeah, but they wouldn't have had the logistics to get the carriers that side of the Pacific. I mean, that was an army that really never understood logistics.
No, they don't. So why have the Chinese surrendered yet? We keep just going.
Yeah. So with we're coming up on our last handful of minutes. One question wanted to ask was, since you review so many books, do you have any up and coming authors you could recommend, or maybe some understated authors that you could recommend with the books that you review?
I guess the question is, what are you looking for? Are we talking fiction, nonfiction?
Your personal, do you feel there are any underrated authors that you're currently reviewing? In your personal opinion, it's completely subjective to you. Is there anybody that you read and you're like, dang, this person should be bigger, but they just need some more time?
If we're talking, I would hesitate to recommend any one individual because that's such an open-ended question. Do I have authors that I really enjoy? And the answer is yes. in science fiction, for example, it would be people like Sarah Hoyt, Dave Freer, and oh, come on, I can't remember his name. I reviewed one of his books a few weeks back.
Don Weber, Drake.
No, this Van Stry.
Okay.
He's new. He wrote one called Summer's End that was excellent, and then another one. Hang on a second, let me check. A lot of it I end up going into my Kindle. And actually, there are some things that I read that Stand Alone by John Van Stry, and that's first part of I think a 5-novel series.
Nice.
But as far as nonfiction goes, oh, come on. Stephen Moore is really good on naval topics. Robert Kaplan.
That's the first author I
is
heard that.
Another one. Carolyn Alexander wrote an excellent book on the Endeavor several years back. She's got one coming out next year called Skies of Thunder about the Hump campaign.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is good.
Tom Clavin. Tom Clavin is another one that's written some excellent history. The Last Outlaws was written by him. He also did The Last Hill last year about the Ranger Battalion that took Pointe du Hoc, and then later fought at the Hertagan Woods.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent book.
Okay.
And I've not read anything by him that I've been disappointed with.
Very nice.
I've never heard that Woods called that before or pronounced that way. That's very interesting.
Yeah. Well, and I appreciate you answering the question the way it was meant to be open-ended, because good tastes have to be built over decades. So I recommend you. I reckon you've come together with probably a good short list of folks that are probably worth listening to, and I'm sure people will appreciate listening back to this. So if they ever need any inspiration, they'll have this little segment here to
just go through my reviews.
All right.
Seriously, I try and get a little bit of everything in those, and it's not just on Ricochet. You can also go to Epic Times. I do typically a review or two a month for them.
Nice.
And I do a book blurb every week for them. Plus, I do review books for National Space Society and Nautical Research Guild. So
that's a pretty good amount of stuff here you've given us, and we've gone through an hour and a half of stuff, and I'm really glad we were able to cover a bit of Pearl Harbor. So it's been great interviewing you, and we'll probably do this again sometime in the future. Good seeing you again, Mark.
Yes, thank you so much. You're a pleasure to talk to an interview.
Okay. Bye-bye.